Hey, what's up everybody? Welcome to this week's Q&A. I finally finished that video on video capture and everything, so if you've emailed me or contacted me or something and I've ignored you, I promise it's not personal. I just have about 100 emails to go through now that I've finished that video in that section. But I really hope people like it. Even if you really have no desire to capture video or stream, maybe it was neat and entertaining, or maybe you just liked the 4K shots of some of the old video games. I don't know, but hopefully it was worth all the trouble. And let's jump right into the Q&As. First up, over on Subscribestar, the importer asked, regarding artificial scan lines that you can add with the XRGB Mini or different cores of the Mister, why do I get a jumping effect whenever the screen scrolls vertically? I don't remember seeing that in any of my displays. If you're only talking about one display that you see this on, it could be that you have processing turned on somewhere on your TV. Remember with gaming that you want to turn off everything. I actually like it all off all the time, but sharpness down to 0, any of that digital processing filters, just go into your menu and turn everything off and then try again. And maybe also check a different brand TV to see if it still looks like that. But I don't think I've seen it the way you've described it. But to be honest, I'm not normally a fan of artificial scan lines, which is all just preference. Things like the GBA Consolizer, I love them because it looks just like the LCD screen of Game Boy Advance and Game Boy. Depending on the game or even the part of the game, I'll leave them on or off, or super dark, or mid-range. And I've started to experiment with and really enjoy scan lines on old movies, which is weird and not about gaming, I know, but just as an experiment, we took an old movie, Tora Tora Tora, so an old World War II movie, tons of film grain. It certainly wasn't cleaned up for modern use. And then I watched that in we broke it up into 4 parts. 480p on the BVM. Looked pretty neat on the 32-inch BVM. It kind of gave it that like a super clear CRT feel. 720p on the BVM looked great, but it started to look so sharp that it was like, should we just watch it on the flat screen? Then I put it on the flat screen through the PS3, 720p HDMI into the OSSC, added scan lines very light, not dark for movies, and then put that into the OLED. And that looked pretty much just like the BVM. Maybe the scan lines were a tiny bit more pronounced, but still you get a sharp image. And then we watched the last 20 minutes of it just straight up into my to the OLED TV through my Oppo 4K Blu-ray player. So it upscales to 4K pretty nicely. And while I was watching it scan lines on, I actually thought like, oh, this is cool, but maybe the scan lines are too much. And when we switched over to just super sharp 4K, I preferred it through the OSSC. So the only other test that I want to do is that same setup, PlayStation 3, 720p into the OSSC, into my Oppo Blu-ray player, and use that scaler as opposed to the one built into my TV, just to kind of see how that looks. That will add tons of lag, so don't ever do that for gaming, but I really feel like that adds to the movie, because it gives it, depending on your feel, it'll either feel like you're watching it on the clearest CRT of all time, or it'll kind of give you that movie theater feel. But either way, you're not looking at like film grain noise all over the screen. The scan lines cut through it. And so my point of rambling about this for 2 minutes is that those two scenarios, GBA Consolizer and old movies, are things that, in my personal opinion, scan lines genuinely add to the image. And into the experience. And while I know a lot of people like it on old games, and sometimes it looks awesome, I think scan lines on a plasma TV kind of look better than an OLED or LED because of the way plasma creates the image. It kind of looks it blends it a little bit better. So it really just comes down to whether you think it adds to it or not. And if you're getting a jumping effect, it obviously doesn't. But I think what'll be a game changer for all retro games on flat screens will be when you could do true 4K scaling and have, it's actually quite complicated because you have to draw the scan lines in between the image as it's being processed, but getting horizontal and vertical scan lines to mimic things like, a 480 TVL CRT, a Sony, which looks a little bit different, Shadow Mask versus Aperture Grill. I think that is when scanlines are really going to start to get beneficial to retro gaming on flat screens, because it'll cut through that image in the same way as CRT would, so you don't see blocky Lego-looking characters, and you don't see those same characters with just lines drawn through them. The lines will kind of move with the characters, as you would have seen on a CRT. So I'd keep messing with it, but I think we have quite a bit of ways to go before scanlines for games look right. And if you want to mess with TV and movies now, you could use any of the methods that I said. First up over on Patreon, Jose Escalo said that I forgot to answer a question last week. And I actually answered it, but somehow it got deleted. That happens. I'm sorry. I'll try not to let that happen too much. It's just the way I record these to make it more efficient. Sometimes things end up in the trash bin. So thank you for re-asking the question, though. I hate when I miss these, either because of timing or my own mistakes. But the question is, what are the use case scenarios that you would use a RetroTink 2X with an OSSC? For me personally, it's anytime you need composite video or S-video. And my personal opinion is that you should take or switch the RetroTink to pass-through mode and let the OSSC do all of the processing. Now, you don't need to worry about the lack of low-pass filter on the VGA input, because that's all taken care of on the RetroTink. So just pass-through mode, no filters, and then do all of the scaling through the OSSC. I've found that for composite video, I like just using the RetroTink, because the OSSC does a great job upscaling, but that also means it does a great job scaling all of the terrible artifacts of composite video. And because there isn't things like a comb filter built directly into the OSSC, it's probably not, it's probably not the best. So I would prefer 480p just out of the RetroTink for composite video. You could try 480p into the OSSC doubled to 960p or something like that, but that's just my preference. And for S-video, I thought it looked great. I mean, you're going to see a difference between S-video and RGB, but just S-video, pass-through mode, let the OSSC do the scaling. I thought it was impressive and certainly worth using if you have an S-video only console. So hopefully that'll clear something up, and if there's another use case that you were thinking about, please ask again, and maybe I could add some perspective. Lars Olschlager had two questions. I'm going to answer the second first because it's easier. He lives in PAL territory and doesn't want to have two consoles. So is there a way to get a NES that will do PAL optimized games in 50 Hertz and then be able to play the rest in 60 Hertz? I believe that you could install a switch. I have almost zero experience with PAL consoles just because the cost to get it here, the amount of testing and all that stuff. But I believe that you can get a region switch that can go between PAL and NTSC and keep the original refresh rates. You'd have to look into that a little bit more. Maybe Bordy might be somebody to ask. If you speak German, jump on the circuitboard.de forums. They're great. They're great. You could use English Translate. The people there are very nice. But if native German speaker would be a lot easier. I think they would be the perfect place to ask for something like this, and I think that could be done. Your next question, you said I mentioned at some point that it's a good idea to replace 7805s with 78S05s. Sorta, I'll get back to that. Was that general advice or a special fix? And then Nick Furlow asked, to add on to that, if someone's replaced their 7805 with a new one, is it still worth replacing that with a 78S05? So the only issue with the 78S05 that I have at the moment is that there were two versions, and they discontinued the thicker version. So theoretically, that means that the only one available now could generate too much heat for a console. In the non-scientific testing I've done, because I did a lot of heat testing for my last company, I loved it, I thought it was a lot of fun, but that involves thermal probes and heat chambers and all that stuff. I have not done that. But in my basic testing, play something for 2 hours, test it with a probe, that's fine type of thing, I found that the thinner ones were totally fine. Genesis and Super Nintendo and TurboGrafx were the ones that specifically I used them on. Once again, non-scientific testing. So, it is a newer, more efficient part than the older 7805. The 7805 has been around for, since the days of Atari 2600. So, I would think at the very least, if you have a console with a 7805, up until the 90s era of things, you don't need to replace it unless it has an issue. but I don't think it could do any harm by replacing it. My personal choice is to replace it, just because all of these things are going to fail at some point, and it might take another 10 years for that to fail, but whatever, I'd rather deal with it now while I'm doing other mods. It's also my personal choice to go with the S05, just because it's newer technology. It's just a slightly updated design, and I haven't had any problems. But I really hate when people say, well, I've done it and it works, which means it's perfect. I'm definitely not saying that. So it's I guess the general way, the general rule to take away from this is if you're doing a bunch of work to a console, especially something like a 2600, without a doubt, just replace the 7805. It's only a few dollars, sometimes less depending on where you get them. Just get good quality ones, obviously. That's kind of a given. Genesis and on, I don't know, maybe. NES, maybe. But I personally would use the 78S05 and then just check it, like game for a couple hours, or even just leave it on for a few hours, and then go back in and hit it with a probe and see if it's past whatever it was before that. You know, I think that's a good general test, is if you let something heat up on the original 7805, test what that temperature is, put the new one on and test that temperature. If it's the same or lower, you should be okay. And I also use thermal paste, which is something I don't know if a lot of older consoles did, or if they did and it wore off or something. But every time I swap it out, I clean the heatsink really well with isopropyl. I mean, scrub it, then hit it with Q-tips. Then I put on some good like thermal Arctic thermal paste. And then I use that, so it really kind of gives it a little bit more heat dissipation. So I know there's a lot of ifs and maybes and I'm not sure's in there, but I just don't want to say yes, do a 78S05 and find out that in one scenario it's overheating. So hopefully I gave you enough information to kind of pick whichever path you'd want to choose on your own. Ghetto Bill Gates asked if I could recommend a couple of models of consumer component CRTs, preferably curved. Well, I really like the JVC D series. That's that giant thing I have behind me. They come in different sizes. I think you can get a 27-inch version, which is probably the perfect size if for one person to carry. It's still heavy, but I could easily carry that myself. Whereas the 32, I used to be able to easily carry that myself, and then I broke myself last year. But the one thing you got to remember is all of these TVs are getting old and are probably going to need a capacitor replacement, which is not easy. The test that I really am looking forward to doing with this TV that I did not do in that video I shot with Jose is do good quality pictures of it as is now through with like the HD Retrovision cables. Something like the Mario World title screen and the Sonic title screen. Two things that we all know and I could spot every difference in. Then do the cap replacement and do that another one of those videos in component. Then RGB mod it and do another video. It is my guess that after doing the cap replacement, RGB and component are going to be a lot closer together than they were in the test that Jose and I did with that Sony. Just because, bypassing almost all of the inputs and just going right to the OSD to the tube, you've missed a third of the caps that are probably aging. So when I say get these, and when I say get any of these TVs, definitely keep in mind that, you could buy 3 of the exact same model and all 3 might look completely different from each other. But all those caveats aside, the JVC D series seem pretty awesome. I really love all of the Sonys with, they all look identical. It's like the 2 stereo speakers in front, the black casing, and they all have a very curved screen, and as soon as you get over the top, it drops right down and follows the contour of the tube. So they all kind of look the same, regardless of size or year. There's many of them out there. They are not component TVs, but they could all be RGB modded, and I really like those a lot. And I'm still kind of out there. There's or looking out there. I think there's a few more JVCs, but as Beefy said, it does seem like most of the CRTs with component inputs had a flat tube or the fake flat tube things. So I really think if you're going to spend the time to do something like possibly recap a TV, refurbish it, maybe RGB mod it, just find one of those Sonys or a really good RCA or JVC tube that looks pretty good, and just RGB mod those. I think there might have been an RCA with a curved tube and component inputs, but there's kind of a debate as to whether those are good tubes or not. Some are for a while there. Now, don't quote me because it's been almost 20 years now, but I think for a while, RCA was working with people like ProScan and Luva on basically, they all shared the same tube and used different electronics or vice versa. So for a while, you could definitely get an RCA TV with junk electronics that has a great tube. So just RGB modding it would be perfect. So I would really, while I think finding a JVC D-series with a component input is a good choice, they're hard to find. They're most likely going to need a cap replacement. So it might just be better to do an RGB mod and just talk to people. I will eventually have a video on that shows how to RGB mod as safe as possible, but it's never perfectly safe. There's always some chance. And like Jose said, there's a few times where he thought he fully discharged the TV, and luckily mostly discharged it, but as he was moving around in there, still got zapped. Now, zapped like, ouch, not like go to the hospital, but it just still proves that there's always a risk when doing these things. So definitely be careful. And I'll try to get some kind of database together of CRTs with component inputs and curved tubes. I don't know how I do that. I'd probably just do a shared Google Doc for now. But I'll start with that, and then we'll kind of go from there. And as we start to do more RGB mods on TVs, and hopefully as some of those ideas I spoke about in the roundup come to fruition, we could really have like a universal standard way of modding these things where you get the best out of it for the least amount of effort. So I'm on it. It's going to take months to get all this stuff together. Any kind of bigger projects like this, I don't want to just throw out a video, because so many people do that. So many people are like, oh, something new, let me do a video on it, and not actually give any real information to try to get more hits. That's never me. If I do something that important, it's got to be thorough, kind of like the capture video. So, be patient, but I'll have something out there, and keep your eyes open for that JVC D-series. Luckily, somebody found me a 36-inch version. I still would really like a 27-inch version just to be able to have all three. So if you have a 27-inch version that you could spare, please let me know. Kelly Greenidge said that he ordered a male-to-male Scart cable from Cable Direct. I think I have the same exact ones here. I have this one, which is I think a 6 or 10 foot. I think it's a 6 foot. And then I also have the 15-foot version hooked up to my OSSC and G-Scart, and that's what I pull out for when I wheel an RGB monitor over. He said it's a beefy cable and shielded great. You're right, but the shielding isn't the way you should do it. The way you should have shielding is the video signal in the middle for each cable on the inside, and then ground wrapped around it as the shielding. And this cable has video and ground next to each other, running through the cable. So there is still room for interference. So my suggestion is, if you're doing anything where the 1% quality matters, you're doing comparison shots, or you want to put up a really high quality video, get some truly shielded cables from Retro Access, Retro Gaming cables, whatever else. The HD Retrovision cables with some converters on each side depending on what interface you're going to. But for me personally, like, I have all my consoles into a G-Scart, all the ones that I keep hooked up, one output with the really shielded cable to the OSSC going to my OLED, because any noise you would definitely notice there. And then that 15-foot Cable Direct is just kind of sitting underneath the shelf thingy that I have. I don't know why I forgot what a shelf was. And then I just kind of uncoil that and plug that into all the monitors. And I don't think I could see a difference. It's to the point where, I stare at these things all day long, and if I don't see a noticeable difference, I'd call it safe to use. So it's a good purchase. They're cheap cables. Everybody who tinkers with this stuff should probably own one just because of how cheap they are. I just wanted to bring that up because if you ever start to do any kind of crazy capturing, it's worth the extra. It's more than twice the price, but it's worth the extra money just to ensure that whatever you're running these cables by don't get interference. And there's a lot of things involved. Are you using composite video as sync? Are you running it next to a bunch of other video lines that are active, next to a power line, and all that other stuff? So it is a great cable. I wanted to make everybody aware of that. And you asked, just dropping in to see how me and my family are doing. Thank you very much. So far, so good. I'm still loving New York. Still loving the apartment. Hope I get the opportunity to stay here a little bit longer. Just trying to grind it through and get our retro RGB, up and running a little more. David Kenyon said he's been wanting to get a Wii Dual and GC HDMI, but would rather wait if there are people working on a solution like the DC HDMI that line doubles to 960p and a 1080p frame. I don't know of anybody working on that now. A lot of people have speculated about it, and I'm not even sure if it would be, I think it would require a total retooling of the mod, and it might even end up being an upscale. So for the short term, I would say just buy those and be confident that you're getting a good solution. I mean, for all I know, somebody's going to release something tomorrow, but I certainly don't know of anything in the works, and there's nothing announced. However, one thing I wanted to point out is that anytime you have a console outputting true digital to digital, never hits the analog spectrum, and you're getting the original one-to-one signal, then any future scaler will be able to handle that perfectly. So while there's nothing available today, at least that I know of, that's good for retro gaming, I'm sure at some point we're going to get a really good 4K retro gaming scaler, and that would be able to take digital HDMI signals in their original resolution and manipulate them properly. So you'd get 960p and a 1080p frame. You can get it however many X up to 4K and have overscan or not, whatever you want to choose. So it is a lot different with consoles that you might be able to, with consoles that are digital to digital and output their one-to-one signal. Even though it might not be as perfect as you want now, it's kind of future-proofed in the fact that it's always going to be the original one-to-one digital signal, and then aftermarket devices will be able to manipulate that after the fact. So, I would go ahead and purchase them now and know that you're probably going to get a really cool device that you like. James H. had a good question. For the MC Cthulhu, do you think you could use a network switch? So for people unaware, you could hook up a network jack to the MC Cthulhu simply just because everything's cheap. The network jack is cheap, network cable is cheap, and you don't have to worry about shielding for game cable or game controller cables. But you're essentially just treating it like any other cable. And network switches digitally read the signal coming down and kind of split them that way. So I don't think so. No, I don't think you would be able to use it. I could be wrong, but I just think that because the MC Cthulhu is simply treating the cable like a cable and a network switch is reading protocols coming down that cable digitally, I don't think it would work. So, if you have a spare switch, maybe give it a try. But I do not expect that one to work at all. It's a pain making those things because it's not like just making the same RJ45. You have to make sure that you line everything up. But as far as cost goes, it's about as cheap as it gets. So I would probably count on making each cable for your console and not doing not going through a switch of any kind. Reginmad was asking about high quality component video switches. He's outgrown most of the consumer level switches and wants the recommendation on where to go. I think the best one for gaming is going to be the G-Comp Switch 8x2. You can get the 4x1 now. I'm not sure if he has any left, but you could find them, but they're only 4 inputs, only 1 output. But they're good. They're one of the few third-party devices that HD Retrovision actually recommends and is officially supported, I guess you could say. And the 8x2 is going to be exactly the same quality with, maybe a few other enhancements. Super G is always looking to find, if you could make something 0.1% better, he'll do it in the next revision. So I guess you could say it's a little bit better, but you'll have 8 inputs and dual outputs, which is pretty awesome. And it's designed for retro gaming signals. It's designed to make sure that no interference is added in your consoles. So while it's going to be, a lot more than a cheap switch, if you're really aiming for quality, that's going to be the one to go for. But there's nothing wrong with the Extron crosspoints. You can get the 8x2s or 8x4s really cheap. You just need to buy a bunch of these converters. I know I talk about it all the time, but really quick. These RCA to BNC adapters you'll need. And my recommendation is for just gaming, not for use with oscilloscopes, but just gaming. Buy a big bag of them. You can get, like 10 for $1 or something like that. Buy a bunch of them and then hook up one console at a time and wiggle each of the cables. And if you get interference on the screen, throw that one out, move on to the next, and just check them all that way. If you're using the scope, just buy the ones that are really expensive and like $5 a piece, because you don't want any chance of interference if you're trying to detect video signals. But for just gaming, just use the Crosspoint, a whole bunch of those, and it's a perfect experience. They're pretty cheap. They're just big. You need the converters. The one advantage is they are a matrix switch. So you could have 8 inputs and 4 outputs, and each of the output could have a different input assigned to it, whereas the G-comp, whatever's in, goes out to both. So, if you need something now, feel confident getting a crosspoint, and heck, if you eventually want the 8x2, the crosspoint can be used for a bunch of different things. So as long as you have the space in your house or apartment, which I'm jealous if you do, because I don't, just keep the crosspoint. You never know what you'll be able to use that thing for, and they're inexpensive enough, at least in my opinion, to keep as a spare. So hope that was the info you were looking for. Matt Holder said he's working on a project that allows you to control BVMs and crosspoints from a Raspberry Pi. That's pretty cool. If you want to, I checked out the link. If you want to write up kind of a description of what it is, I'll turn that into a news post. Because while that's, it's something I could never use because I'm constantly unplugging, replugging, and doing things, people with stationary setups might be able to just add network cables and or serial cables to all this, connect it all in, and have a very automated setup. So that's pretty cool. If you wouldn't mind emailing me that or something, or through Patreon. And also, he wanted to know that he was able to buy cheap Walmart black web speakers and added copper tape on the inside to shield it. So that's exactly the type of thing I was suggesting last week. Maybe just buy the speakers with some more space on the inside and metal spray, copper tape, whatever else, and maybe that would be good enough. And I'd certainly like to mess with a little bit of that myself to do some testing, but it's a pretty good tip. Brian Nolan asked if I knew anybody who would install the 2600 RGB board into the 2600 Junior. I guess both of the installers on Tim's site aren't currently doing the mod. Do I know of anybody in the US? So Jose Cruz, Mobius Strip Tech, iFix Retro. There's so many great modders. I feel bad when I forget who's who, but the only thing I will say is that installing that mod into a 2600, like a 4-switch or 6-switch, is fairly easy. It's time consuming, but it's kind of easy. But installing that into a Junior is pretty complicated. So whoever does it, please make sure that they know it's a Junior and remind them that it's a complicated mod. The people I mentioned probably already know that, but just, I would ask around maybe on Shmups or the Atari Age forums, or maybe just contact those people directly on Twitter and see if they'd be willing to do it. It's not the easiest mod, so it's certainly, like, anybody with basic skills and some patience could do that SNES Mini RGB mod, but not this. So just make sure people are aware and that they know what they're getting themselves into. Nick Furlow said that he got the Extron Crosspoint Ultra 84 and was thinking about making some of his own cables, like Scart to BNC or Phoenix to RCA, etc. Do I ever make my own cables? I freaking hate making my own cables. This is just preference. This is just my opinion. But the last time I made my own cable, it took like 2 hours. And I had to redo it twice because of strain relief and things popping off. And when I finally got it done, it was great. I mean, I was very proud with the results, and I think it's probably still in this drawer right here. I think it was a Scart to VGA cable. It came out great, everything was fine, but at the end of the day, I just, 2 hours of my time, I'd much rather spend the money and just have it made for me, because I'm scrambling for every extra minute I can to write these articles, get the videos up, to have time to do things that I really love, like these Q&As. So for me personally, the thought of spending 2 hours, with tweezers and, flux and making sure everything's perfect and strain relieved, forget it. I would never do that. But if you enjoy soldering projects, and this is something that, it's part of your journey is building these things and making everything yourself. I know a lot of people who, it's not just the games, it's the whole process that they really love. Then just find yourself some cables. I think Jacob Proctor was the one selling shielded cable on his website. I think I might have some in here somewhere in my drawer right here, but he was selling cable that's shielded on the outside, but each individual conductor on the inside is also shielded. And that would be the perfect scenario, because that's where you get, you could run composite video as sync, and it will be equally as clear as C-Sync. You actually can't, because Extron Crosspoints can't take composite video async, but hopefully you understood the reference. So, maybe look for that cable, buy it. If you can't find small amounts, you could try to buy it in bulk. But it's going to be like $100 for a few feet of it, because it's expensive cable. So I would just keep all that stuff in mind, and really consider: are you in this because you're looking to do this as a project, or are you in this because you're just trying to solve the problem and play your games? And if it's the second, just buy some cables and save yourself all the trouble. Dylan said, a while ago someone made a file to 3D print the start and reset buttons for the SNES Junior, so when you did the Super CIC mod, you could install the LED into the start button instead of drilling a hole. Is anyone able to find it? He can't find it while Google searching. It's a great question. If somebody has those links, let me know. At the very least, I'll link to them in the 3D print section of the website, even if I can't host the files. That seems like a good thing. And, I mean, you guys know me by now. Anything that spares you from cutting plastic, I would go for, just because I like my mods to be fully reversible. So yeah, if anybody knows, please let me know. Matt Hanola said that I had mentioned a Symphony of the Night patch on this week's roundup that patches the dithering. I was curious what improvement you see and where to locate the patch. So it's just sharper overall. There's no dithering patterns in the background. And I can understand why Sony would have done that, or Konami back in the day, to try to make the PlayStation look more futuristic and blending. But when you start playing these things on higher quality monitors or flat screens, you just see the X's. You don't see the dithering blend everything together. So yeah, I think it's worth it. It's kind of the only way I play right now. Chris Covell posted the patch on his Twitter page. And not only that, he also wrote a tool on how to add this to other games and to try to look for dithering options on other games. So I would just check out his Twitter feed. I probably should have a link for that on the site somewhere. So if you find it, please let me know. And if you don't find it, I'll just ask Chris, and I'll make sure to post it somewhere on the site. BFB had a couple of questions. First, with the LL Cool Joy coming, wondering what you would recommend for a flexible MiSTer setup, best for adding it down the line from a noob perspective. So my strong opinion is buy the DE10 Nano, buy the $7 USB hub, and I think it's $10 for the Wi-Fi adapter. You need the USB hub for that, and that's the bare minimum for the MiSTer setup, and that's the only thing that you need. From that point on, use whatever's easier for you. The LL Cool Joy is coming at some point. At the moment, I believe the BlissBox is looking to add MiSTer support directly to the MiSTer. And the BlissBox is kind of expensive. All the adapters are expensive, but they're all really high quality, and they've been out for years. So I would guess that once everything's out there, it's going to be preference-based. Some people are going to think the BlissBox is better for their scenario. Others might think the LL Cool Joy for theirs. But the bottom line is, as long as you have the DE10 Nano, the USB adapter and the Wi-Fi, then you're good to go. And all of those are linked right on the website, just retrorgb.com/MiSTer or MiSTer.html. Yeah, but so that's all you need to start. You get HDMI out, and then the SD card, or not the SD card, the RAM edition is the only other thing that you would need to play a lot of the other cores, and that might change as well too. I'm not sure if the Neo Geo core and others might require a RAM update, but those aren't too expensive. So that's the only other thing that might change in the short term. Next question. Do you find retro gaming cables and retro access cables to be equivalent for noise suppression? You have a pack-a-punch for an AV Famicom that's still a little buzzy in the audio. You came across the post Retro Access did of why 75 ohm coax cabling should be the best for video signals. So overall, yeah, I like both of those companies. I like both their cables. And my gut tells me that your buzz is probably inside the AV Famicom. I've heard a lot of people talk about audio issues in those. I believe Voltar's talked about it a few times. So, I mean, there's a whole debate on whether you would notice the difference between those. They're both really high quality, and if you're super curious, maybe just buy one of the Retro Access ones to see. But if you're picking up buzz on the audio lines, from an AV Famicom, an RGB modded AV Famicom, I think that would mean that the signal would either have to be leaking through the other cables inside the main cable, which the Pack-a-Punch shouldn't do, or you're getting interference somewhere else, assuming it's not in the console. So maybe you have it run next to a wall that the main power line of your house is in, which the Pack-a-Punch should also shield for that as well. So my guess is that it's the AV Famicom itself. If you don't want to mess with that, maybe buy one of the other cables just to see, but that's kind of what I would guess. And your last question is about an upcoming PS2 HDMI mod. I honestly don't know anything about that at all, but to address your question, will PS2's modded for C-Sync affect that? While I don't know anything about that mod, my guess is that will not affect any kind of digital mod whatsoever, because now you're talking about modding something that's already after the video output, which any kind of digital mod would go before the video output. So I personally love doing that to PS2s for people that already have Scart setups. It's the only advantage of it is if all of your consoles are Scart except PS2, this is the perfect solution. If all of your consoles are component, just get the HD Retrovision PS2 component cables, equal output, no advantage whatsoever to doing this. So it really is just ease of use in your existing setup. Sean Salis-Lyon was talking about the OSSC and 960p processing. So first, I believe what he was saying, that getting a 960p signal straight into the TV he uses looks better than 960p into a Crystalio 2 into the TV. So my opinion on that is it's all based on what TV you use. For me personally, my LG C6 or B6, I can't remember now, but my LG OLED TV handles 960p signals amazingly. It looks just, in almost every case, I think it looks perfect, because you get that integer scaling of 480p to 960, so it's kind of sometimes a little too sharp, and then my TV stretches that out to 4K, so you kind of get the best of both worlds, and that's just luck. It just happens to be that mine does that well. My 1080p plasma had no clue what 960p was and would mostly freak out and ruin the image. It was pretty much unplayable. The few occasions it still kind of looked a little weird. So that really is just going to come down to somebody's TV. So yeah, my suggestion for people who need 960p support is just try it first and then look into other processing. Also, you'd like to get 480p HDMI signals into the OSSC to try to scale those. He saw the recommendations on the site of some of the converters, but would like to know about video quality. Will it be significantly affected? Anytime you touch the analog domain, you're going to get noise. Period. No discussion. It's just how much noise. Is it noticeable? Does it affect the signal? Those are all kind of the things that you might run into. And if you saw the video I just posted about 4K scaling from original consoles, you might have noticed that some of the games with solid colors in them, the Sky and Sonic, the Green Grass, and A Link to the Past, even those, in the most painstaking scenario I could imagine, fully shielded cables, the adapter with just the DVI dongle, so you're not adding any more analog length to it. The most painstaking results I can get, you still see the analog interference when going from 240p to 4K. Whereas I imagine if I were to have taken like the Super NT and scaled that to 4K, solid colors would just be solid colors. So that's what the type of thing you might have to deal with. So in the future, if there's a version of the OSSC that accepts HDMI, I would say don't bother with anything else. Keep it in the digital realm and you never have to worry. But if you're just looking to mess around, those HDMI to VGA converters are like $10, $15. So I would say just try it. Especially because the ones like the 10DAC, you plug the HDMI cable into it and you only have analog signal that's this long before it goes into the OSSC. So the chance of adding extra noise is slim. You might be able to go in there and mess around with it. As for what's the best converter, there was a topic on the Shmups forum debating this, and it might be different per console. and there's one HDMI to VGA scenario I will be testing soon. So hopefully I'll be able to have some more data for you on that. But once again, even in the upcoming video I'm working on, that's still a scenario in which that might be the best solution for that setup and not for everybody's. So I would just start with that 10 DAC one, give it a try. They're cheap enough where if this is something that's important to you, you could afford to buy a couple of them and not break the bank. And Porkchop Express 85 said a quick question about SNES stuff. He acquired a SNES Mini last week that had power issues and replaced the AC panel with one that he had from a spare parts box. Not sure what you mean by AC panel. Do you mean the AC adapter? But recapped everything, including the big cap, added a 78SO5 with the 470 microfarad cap for the vertical line fix, and still only gets power that lasts for a few seconds before it dies out. So to be clear, it powers on with video and audio, but dies out quickly. So the first thing I would try is a new AC adapter. You seem to know what you're doing, obviously, so maybe pop open that AC adapter and try the capacitor in that. But also try to look into one of those Power Plus adapters that I always talk about with a few of the converters, and just to see, because that's the first thing I would think is it's that. The next thing is I'm vaguely remembering a scenario which one of my friends did a cap replacement and put one of the caps in backwards, and something similar happened. Which I'm certainly not. I'm not trying to tease you or anything. I mean, everybody makes mistakes, so there's always a possibility that for whatever precautions you may have taken, that something could have gone in backwards. Certainly not teasing, just saying it happens. So I would check the polarity of the capacitors, but I'm immediately thinking AC adapter would be the first thing to try. I think Jose or Ben, I can't remember who, but they had sent me a few pictures of they modded a SNES, worked fine, and then they brought it over to their other setup and it didn't work, using all of the power, all of the cables that the customer sent them. So on their test bench with theirs, it worked fine, and they hooked it up to their TV for one final test and it had issues. Of course, almost all modders would immediately go, what did I do? They checked it out, everything's fine. And then just on a hunch, they opened up the power supply that the customer had sent them, and the cap was totally all leaked out and crappy. So that's certainly the thing that my gut would tell me is the thing to look out for. All right, well, that's it for this week. Probably good timing because I'm not sure if you could hear, they're starting construction outside again. So there's horns and smashing and hammers and stuff. Hopefully that didn't drive people listening audio only too crazy. But anyway, thank you very much for participating. Anybody who wants to ask any question can just post wherever you found the newest video in this. So if you're one of the newer subscribers on YouTube, just go into the private channel links and check out the posts there. Just comment right on the latest video. Same thing with Patreon, Subscribestar, Bitbacker, wherever, because this is really a supporter-focused thing. I do release these to the public about a month after they air, but I usually disable comments. I actually usually forget, then somebody comments, and then I disable them. But the comments and the questions are supporter-focused. So definitely ask anything you'd like wherever you found this video. And the only thing to note is because of logistics, I really could only check the newest video. So if I missed your question, if I answered it wrong, please just post anything you have in the newest video, and I'll get to it the following week. So as always, thank you so much for participating. I really enjoy doing these things, and I'll see everybody soon.